Okay, it is started again.
Hmm.
I'm just gonna kind of go down the list like we did last time from top to
Okay.
bottom.
Yeah, that's fine.
Um, we're starting at 616. Okay. So for my first question, I said Locke argued that the mind is a blank slate that becomes written on through experiences. How can assuming that students come into the classroom as a blank slate become dangerous?
So one thing I thought about was, you know, when you assume that they are a blank slate, you kind of take out the fact that they have prior knowledge and experiences. And this could like be dangerous for them when they, have different backgrounds that they can bring to the table. It can, I feel like it could lead to failure because you're not allowing them to open up to that, or you are kind of maybe even suppressing it and not valuing their backgrounds and their prior knowledge.
I also think that whenever you just think that they have a blank slate, I personally feel like you don't want to teach them something they may already know. And when you think that they have this blank canvas, you might be teaching something that they already know, but you're assuming that they don't know that or that they don't have any previous knowledge on what you're currently teaching.
Just to kind of piggyback off of that, I actually had this kind of happen today. I'm bad about assuming that kids know like their letter sounds and stuff. And so we've been doing I got Wilson certified with the reading program last year. And so we've been trying to use it. And so I just automatically start up at this one set at the like step 1.3 because I think, oh, that's where they're all at because I teach upper grades and that's where they should be. And then I pulled this kid today and I was like, whoa, he knows 20 of his letter sounds. Like I've got to like back up. So just those assumptions can just get you in trouble when you assume, I mean, blank slate with like, you assume they have all the same exposures and you assume they have the same experiences when they all come from different backgrounds. Like this kid has had a very different home life than some of my other kids. So he has had a lack of exposure. So assuming that he has the same blank slate as somebody else in my classroom was definitely not, I have to regroup a little bit based off of that.
I think also talking about them having different experiences, those experiences lead to misconceptions a lot of the time. And if you think that a student is coming into the classroom with no knowledge of anything, then a lot of those misconceptions aren't addressed. I know that one of the things I do before I teach a lesson is I sit down and I think, what is something that they could potentially think that's not accurate that I might need to address in the lesson? Because obviously we try to activate prior knowledge and see what they already know or what they think. But sometimes we still don't see those misconceptions, and it's important to try to eliminate them and address it so that students are understanding that the way they previously thought is not accurate. But if you think that they have no knowledge prior to the lesson or whatever it is that you're teaching, then you're not going to be able to address those misconceptions.
I think along those same lines, oh, you're right about addressing misconceptions, but you're also not valuing what they can add to the conversation. I think this kind of goes along with what Andrea said, but like whether it's culturally or something they learned, or like say a kid's really passionate about a certain hobby subject or something like that, if you're not getting to know them and knowing what is already there on that slate that's not blank, you're missing out on a lot of really great things that they could be adding to the conversation, which I think also builds relationships with them and by doing that.
Speaking of that, Kim, like, have you seen where maybe unintentionally we have not, I guess, thought about their prior knowledge or thought about and valuing their cultural experiences, and it can lead to like disengagement or even frustration from them. And I say Kim just because you were speaking, but like, and just in general, like, I guess I think about, when kids aren't interested, as you said, because it's not a topic that they have, could that lead to like even like behavior problems and things in the classroom?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think like sometimes, I guess when I was saying that, I was picturing like the kids who want to talk to you about this like super random interest that they have, like something that maybe you can't relate to, but hearing that and then finding some way to tie that into your lesson to show that kid like, hey, you brought this up to me, that, find some way that that can relate to something you're talking about, maybe not even in that moment, but later down the road. And then say, like, because I think that just shows them you were listening and that you know something about them now, something that background knowledge.
Going
And
off
sometimes that leads to,
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
You can go ahead, Kensi. You're okay.
Sometimes that leads to like some of the most fruitful like conversations and like the most learning. I find that oftentimes when we go off the script, it makes it, I don't know, the kids enjoy it more. It's not like robotic. I mean, not all of us are robotic, but I feel like sometimes we can just like teach to the test and like do what we're supposed to do and teach the standard and then just be done with it. And so when you kind of go off script a little bit, it does allow them to kind of share their experiences. And then it also allows some different conversations and discussions to take place, which I think only enriches their learning.
All right, I will go ahead and read the next question. I said, this is a quote from what the grammar of schooling chapter. I can't remember who wrote it, sorry. Parents and school trustees often came to the classroom to see what the children had learned, and they frequently took an active part in making decisions about education. It was later stated that the one-room school was seen as inefficient, unprofessional, meager in curriculum, and subordinated to lay control, the teacher being too much under the eye and thumb of the community. How much involvement should the parents have in the decision as to what is taught in the classroom? So this kind of loaded, but like consider, the book bans that are going on, state and religion, gender and gender identity, racial injustice, all of those topics that we as educators sometimes shy away from because we don't want to upset anybody. How much do you think the parents should be involved in what is taught in the classroom, or do you think they should be involved at all?
So as a teacher in a public setting, I feel like I I see it from a different lens as like other parents. Like I don't have kids currently, but like have a different perspective than what parents do. But I feel like parents and community members need to be involved in it, because if they don't feel like they have a say in it, then they're not going to really care. They're going to kind of goes back to that disinterest. They're not going to be interested in it. And I, for one, if a parent is not interested in their kid's education, then it carries over into the kid, and the kid is not, engaged in their learning, and they don't care. They could care less about their education or getting an education, and they just get into trouble. But then also I see the other side of it. I live in a small town, and there have been so many different homeschools like that have opened up, like they're Christian based. And that's just something that has really kind of grown and flourished over the last couple of years. And the only reason I can think of that is because parents don't want, they see what's going on in some of the schools, and they see like what's being taught, and they don't agree with it. And as a parent, like, if you're a parent, you have that right. But also, I don't know, I can see both sides of it. But like I said, I've seen the homeschooling kind of increase around where I live. And so that's just kind of been interesting to see how that has kind of changed over the years.
So I think I like that you brought up the homeschooling, because I think if, like, you're absolutely right, parents 100% have the right to say, I don't want my child to learn this, or I would prefer they learn this. And I think that homeschooling route is the way to go if that's your preference. Um, I think the issue comes from when parents absolutely should be involved. If you don't like the rigor, you think like, hey, this is way too easy, or this is way too hard, or, maybe that particular curriculum is not hitting all the standards or something like that. I think all of that input, that engagement is wonderful. I think when you start trying to push your personal beliefs, like religious, political, any of that sort of thing in the classroom, parents or teachers, like that's where you run into issues, because we're all just so diverse in our beliefs that we can't really say like, no, I don't believe that, so you can't teach that to my kid. Well, how about we have that lesson in class, and then you are so involved in the curriculum that that was taught in class, and then when you get home you can have a conversation and say, some people may think this, but we think this, and here's why. And I think if they're involved in that way so that they can supplement at home that belief system, like perfect, great, but you can't really say don't do this because I don't believe this. That's not really fair.
Going
I
off
also,
of what,
oh,
sorry. Going off of what Kim was saying, I kind of struggle with this question myself just because I was like in that political versus academic. There's that line where, like Kim said, if you don't want me to teach it because you don't feel the same way, then that's really, like you said, not fair. But when it comes to maybe you think the curriculum is too difficult, or maybe books that we're sending home is too difficult for your child, then that's a whole different perspective. But when it comes to you not wanting me to teach that just because you feel different than I do, I feel like that's a whole different story because I feel like academically, most of the times we're going to know best. Um, and my biggest thing was like on books. Sometimes books are like portals to different life experiences that may teach these kids maybe like empathy or how somebody felt in a certain situation that without that book we may be able to teach it but not as good as we could if we used that book. So my biggest thing was just, is it political or is it academic, and at what point can the parent decide you shouldn't teach it because it's an academic reason, or is it because of a political or a belief?
I would agree. But I would also say that, parents should have an opportunity to give that input and feedback, but for that buy-in, kind of like Kensi said. But I think they're not the experts in the teaching of the curriculum. And so I think, by having parent um, input kind of is like a checks and balances too, where yes, we need to ensure that it matches the standards and it matches what's supposed to be taught. But at the end of the day, the final decision comes back to the people who are the experts in that. But I do agree as well with Kensi and Kim about the homeschooling. I think the one, I guess, concern with that is when these parents then begin to pull their kids out and they want to homeschool them, and then they finally realize that they can't do that, and so the kids then come back to the classroom, and I know that's a different kind of animal, but I think it kind of is a cyclical cycle here too, is where these parents want to have all this input, but then at the end of the day it's harming the children even more so than exposing them to different ideas, like you said, Mariela.
So this is kind of similar, but a little bit of a different direction. So, there's topics that, say, for social studies is a really big one. When we teach that, a lot of the times the history book presents one side, right? It presents our perspective most of the time. And my biggest thing is teaching students to critically think. So I teach the standard, right? But I let them go beyond the standard and explore multiple perspectives. Like, for example, I teach about Thomas Jefferson. I don't just teach them the good things that he did, right? I teach them a whole picture of who he was. Do you think that teaching students to be critical thinkers could help combat that discussion parents want to have about what you teach their student or their child, I guess, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I would actually think when their students or when their children are kind of critically thinking, and they can also then bring those arguments per se home and try to defend both sides of it. Because I think, as you said, when we're only teaching the good things of Thomas Jefferson, that's kind of what we were taught growing up. And so unless those parents have done the digging for themselves, they're not aware of that. And I know another question later talks about teaching, both sides of it, like kind of like Rosa Parks being the hero. And, that's what we teach Rosa Parks. Well, she was only one small piece of that puzzle. And so I think the more that we can expose our students and sending that home, I think would definitely help the parents become more aware of both sides.
All right, I'll go ahead and read the next question. This was Kim's question. She said, when reading about child and community centered progressivism in politics and philosophy, I took particular notice of the following quote. In short, Parker had introduced a curriculum that began with the child's understanding and then sought out appropriate content, materials, and experiences to support academic learning. This differed markedly from conventional approaches that began with inflexible content, materials, and approaches and expected the student to adjust to them. What do you think of Dewey's model of this philosophy? What does child-centered instruction look like in your classroom?
I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the blank slate of, child center in the classroom and Dewey's philosophy. And it was like tapping into their interest. And so I think connecting it to their personal lives and making it more relevant to the individual student is important. And so, in our classroom, when I taught middle school, we allowed them to have some say-so over the books that they read when it came to like literary nonfiction. So while we had, a plethora of books for them to choose from, they still got to have some say-so. We just limited the genre because then, we had kids that were reading about political things or kids that were reading about sports or those sort of things. Sorry. And so I really think by getting them engaged in reading what they wanted to read, we got better results and we were actually able to dig deeper into the skills because they were interested in the content.
So sorry.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead. I cut you off last time. You go first.
So I feel like this kind of relates back to the one class schools or one room schools that we read about this week, because I remember when I was reading, it said that they were inefficient, right? That everyone was grouped together and it allowed them to focus on individual students. But that was back when schooling was first coming around. We weren't really sure of what education was, what was expected out of it. And now we have all these students in our classrooms and they're on an expected level, right? In the first grade, they're expected to know their letters and to begin blending them and segmenting them and decoding. But not everyone is at that level. And to me, I feel like Dewey's understanding that we had to find the appropriate content, materials, and experiences. I feel like that's what I do every day in my classroom because yes, all my students that are in a graded school, they're expected to be on a certain level, but they're not. They're all on different levels. I have 5 different levels in reading that I'm working with, and I have to go and find the materials that are appropriate for them. And I have to be flexible because yes, they're all expected to reach the first grade standards by the end of the year, but that's probably not going to happen realistically. Not everyone's going to be at that end goal when they're supposed to at the end of first grade. So for example, like we work with expeditionary learning. I don't know if y'all are familiar with that, but it's a reading program and it's a reading and writing program. And it has a skills block and a module time. And the module time is not very flexible. We teach students things that might relate to them. Like we're working on tools and work right now. So we have them complete challenges to learn about habits of character and what tools are for. We provide them with guiding questions and it's almost project based. And everybody works on it together to build a magnificent thing and to kind of pique students' interest. But then we relate that to our skills block where we're teaching them phonics. And that is where the individualized instruction comes in. And like I said, I have 5 different groups. So we have like early partial, pre-alphabetic, and I pull them and work with them on the specific skill that they need. So some of my friends, like you said earlier, Kensi, like you have friends that you expect know the ABCs, right? The letters. But when I pull these kids, I'm still working on the letter A. And they're in first grade, they're expected to know their letters, but a lot of them don't. And then I have some kids who are well beyond that and they're working on vowel teams. So it really is individualized. And I feel like Dewey's perspective is still seen in schools a lot now, because at least Gwinnett County, the focus of our instruction is small group. We don't focus on whole group instruction that much. Like, I'm at the front of the room for 10, 15 minutes each subject, and then I'm expected to be in small group and have differentiated stations for my kids to work at. So I definitely think that his philosophy kind of plays over into my school and really my district in general in my classroom, because everything I do in there is individualized to each child and what they know prior to the learning that we're about to do.
It's one of those things, like, y'all know, when we were going through our undergrad, everybody was like making differentiation like a really, really big like deal. And I was like, oh my goodness, how am I going to differentiate for all of these kids? But then, like, once I got into it, I was like, wait, we differentiate for kids every single day. And it can be even like the smallest of things, like changing the Lexile level of a passage, or an AI, y'all. I don't know if y'all have used AI any, but like it will like change the Lexile, like same content, same everything, but like based on elementary school, like kids who can't read, it'll like change it. Oh, it's fantastic. But I digress. Anyways, but it just makes me think of differentiation. Like, that's more individualized for each kid. And I feel like teaching special education, that's kind of where I am anyways. I kind of just start with, I have the standards in the back of my head, but also I'm like, there are gaps with this fifth grader that were, they missed it in kindergarten or first grade for whatever reason, whether it be a behavior that impeded the learning, or another kid's behavior impeded their learning, like something caused them to have a gap. And so I have to kind of adapt to that and differentiate for that specific student. But there are other kids that are in that group as well. So it's easy to like kind of group them together. Like Delaney was talking about how she does small groups. Hall County is pretty much the same thing. Like, we are expected to have our mini lesson done in 10 minutes. Now, like I said, I teach special education, so I don't do as much as many lessons. I just really do rotations. But, I just feel like differentiation just kind of goes along with this as well. And I just was like, oh my goodness, that just makes me think of that. So that was one thing that stood out to me. And then also a quote that I actually wrote down in my notes while I was reading came from page 89. And it says, Dewey's curriculum began with familiar experiences, then moved to more distant and abstract ideas, and finally led children to grapple with broad social themes. It just kind of goes back to Delaney talking about like critical thinking. Like, you start out with those familiar experiences and their interests, and that kind of builds. And so then they get there, and then they get interested. And then as they get older, you can go, like in middle school and high school, you can get them to think critically. I know we tried to do that in elementary school, but it doesn't always work. And so hopefully we have enough gaps filled so that they can critically think. Once they get to middle school and high school, they can establish those skills.
Well, as a middle school teacher, we appreciate your work in helping them develop those skills. The reason this quote stood out to me so much is because we actually had, I don't know if you know who Kate Roberts is, but she's been at our school for the past couple of days, and she was phenomenal. Like, she came in and she co-taught with some teachers, and then she observed other teachers and left feedback. And she's coming back to our school later this year. And one of the things we talked about with her is, like, I teach ELA and social studies. My degree is in social studies education. And so I never learned about teaching ELA. I just took the case and passed it, and they said, here you go. So I feel a lot of times ill-equipped to teach strategies, right? Like, to when kids are struggling. I have the curriculum. We use the Lucy Calkins curriculum here. And so I have that, and I have other like things that teachers have given me. And because I'm a relatively intelligent person, I can look at that and say, okay, here's how I should teach that. But when it comes to like those basic skills of meeting those kids where they are when they're struggling, I'm like, I don't really know how to do this. And so that's one of the things I asked of her is like, I need help with strategies. And she talked about just having like a page of just a list of different strategies you could use. So when you're working with a particular child and you see, hey, you're really struggling with this thing, let me look at my little bank here, and this is what I'm going to use for you. And a differentiation that you were talking about, and being able to just pull those strategies out and meet kids where they are, I think is going to make a big difference with who I am as a teacher. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about that.
I think that also leads to flexibility, though, Kim, like as you're talking about, like as you see kids needing different strategies depending on the area, in which you're working. It might be nonfiction versus, fiction or that sort of thing. They're going to have different needs. And so I think being adaptable, kind of as you were mentioning, of seeing it and being flexible in that grouping and stuff, leads back to, kind of what Dewey was like, his processes too. And so I think, but that's differentiation. I agree. I think they just put those big words to stress us out.
So going off of what most of you said, when I read that question, actually, I wrote down the quote that Kensi said, because that's the first one that just popped up to my head when I read the question. But most of y'all were talking about differentiation, and that's exactly what I was thinking. Last year was my first year teaching, and I only had, well, I started with 10 kids in kindergarten. And then we got added more and more, but I only ended up with 13 kindergarten kids the whole year. And most of those students had gone to pre-K, but I had a few that hadn't. So I had to basically make whole new lesson plans for them because I had to meet them at their level where their classmates were up here, they were still down here. Um, and it was a very difficult change because this year we had 19 students. So for me, it was very different to go from 13 to 19, which I know it's still a small number compared to other schools. But this year, I've really struggled with meeting them at their level because I have students that are all over the board. And like Kim was saying, when it came to meeting them at their level, I felt like I had no idea what I was doing. So I just had to like kind of step back and see where each of them was and how I could bring in those experiences or those background languages that they knew, and where I could bring that into the classroom and use it in there and maybe even help the other students or teach the other students something new. But it was just very interesting to see sorry, I lost my train of thought. Um yeah. Sorry.
So real quick, what are your thoughts on, like, what if we didn't separate students by grades and did it more of grouping where they were, obviously within reason, but like, you're talking about kindergartners and first graders who don't even know their letters, where you've got some who are like, well, reading very well. Like, I know we do some classroom grouping like that, and I don't mean, I guess, like all day, but like more flexibility grouping among grade levels. Like, what, I know in special ed we've done that, like for our like interrelated classes. I just didn't know what anybody else thought about that.
I personally don't love the idea of that. I try to stick to heterogeneous grouping in my classroom, unless it is like individualized small group. Like even my stations, I have them work in groups with other people who are not on the same level as them, based on the sole fact that, like, for example, I have kids who are pulled out for ESOL, and I have kids who are pulled out for reading recovery and EIP, and the kids know. You want to think that a 6 and 7-year-old's not going to understand that they're lower than everyone else, but they do. And I've had kids who have cried to me about the fact that they're not as smart as their classmates and they don't understand why they don't get it. And I feel like in middle school and high school, even, like I was in the not gifted, but advanced placement class, whatever you want to call them. And I was aware that everyone else around me was like me. But my best friend, who was in the regular classes, she knew that, oh, she wasn't as smart as the gifted people, or she wasn't as smart as the kids in the honors classes. And I feel like it can negatively impact the way that students think of themselves, especially when they're that young. If they get that mindset at 6 or 7 that they're less than somebody because they're not as smart as them, or they don't understand the content as fast as everyone else does, then that's going to affect them forever. Like that mindset's going to carry through with them. So I personally don't love that idea. I think that, you know, it could help teachers, right? Because it is very stressful to have such differing levels. Like last year, I had kids who were still on pre-K level, and I had kids who were on like a fifth grade level. And it was nearly impossible to meet all the needs of everybody. But at the same time, it made me feel accomplished when I did because I was doing what I needed to meet them where they were. And the kids didn't feel like they were singled out as much because I tried not to make it obvious in my class who was higher and who was lower, because I don't want kids to have a negative self-perception of themselves.
I would agree. I just wondered. I would say, again, so I've taught previously in a middle school as well, and it was very difficult because we would often have kids who would say, oh, but they're on the gifted team. And it's like, there's no gifted team. It's a gifted classes. And, we tried to even steer away from the gifted classes, as they would call it, because it really did create a lot of stress, especially for my students that I was teaching in a small group resource setting, who we had tried to integrate them into a heterogeneous homeroom that also had students who were not, receiving special ed support. And it really became very contentious. But I also feel like sometimes it gives teachers a sense of superiority because they feel like they're teaching students that are better. And so it caused a lot of stress and tension, and it ended up, there was a few blowups, I'm not going to lie, among the staff, because many of us were advocating for all students to be treated equally, and then others were, not wanting that. So anyway, I just wondered your thought, kind of wanted some, other people's input on that.
I will say before we change, I know we need to move on to the next question, but my school did a K1 grouping. So they took like the high kindergartners, like they always do a screener before the kids start in kindergarten. So the parents bring them in, they do screeners, whatever. But years ago, well, 2 or 3 years ago, they did a K1 class. And so the kids who scored well on that screener and they were high or medium, they fell into that category. They kind of went to that K1 group, whereas the kids who, needed a little bit more attention, they kind of went to just the kindergarten classrooms. And so that kind of separated them out a little bit in that area. They don't have that anymore because we were like busting at the seams with kids, so we got rid of it. But anyways, I just was like, that was one thing that came into mind when she talked about those grouping, was that we did do that for a couple of years. The teachers loved it, but I didn't really have any part of it, so I just was kind of like, okay, whatever. And yes, the teachers it does get very contentious. I had a group of people who really, they only taught the gifted kids. Like the gifted kids were the ones that were in the class. And then the last 2 years ago, she got like 7 or 8 of my sped kids, and it was chaos. It was so bad.
All right. The next question says, in Why the Grammar of Schooling Persists, the author asks, what does the historical experience suggest about attempts today to refashion the grammar of schooling? Should one conclude that it is impossible to improve schooling in basic ways? How would you answer those questions?
Okay, I can go first on this one. Since it was my question, I have all the stuff underlined already. So I wrote those questions because as I was reading, I was like, oh, look at that. They already asked the questions for me. But I like if you continue on after where those questions are asked, they say, like, we think not that it's not impossible that schools can change, but that it just has to be a gradual and steady thing. That I think too often we get caught up in like the latest thing that has to revolutionize education and has to change everything we're doing. And it just doesn't. Like, one of the things right above where those questions are, it says like, it's like talking about teachers, and it's like what they learned still remained part of their potential teaching repertoire when their schools return to more conventional patterns. So we pick and choose the things that we like or that worked well from each of these big ideas. And I think if we continue to do that kind of thing, like look closely at different curriculums or different big ideas in education, different philosophies, and we continue to look at the good things about them, because not every philosophy is just wonderful and has all the answers, but there are a lot of good things built into each one, I think. And if you can dig through that and find what works for your particular school or the community that you teach, and then continue to add those things as you learn more, then that's how education can change gradually.
I also think that when it says, should one conclude that it is impossible to improve schooling in basic ways, to me, that's settling, right? Like, we're expected to teach a certain thing and not everyone's on board with it, but you have to teach it, right? Because that's what you're told to teach. But I will tell anybody, my admin, I don't care who it is, when I shut my room, it's my four walls and I do what's best for my students. I don't care if you tell me to teach one thing. If it's not what my students need, that's not going to be my main focus for that day. And people might hate that, but I do what is in the best interest of them. And to sit there and assume that schooling cannot get better, I feel like that's just giving up and not doing what's best for your students. And I can completely relate to the like needing to change everything at the same time, right? Like Gwinnett County is the absolute worst about rolling out every single change they possibly could in the exact same moment. Like for example, we went through 6 different programs last year, pilots at the same time. And I wanted to pull my hair out because I was like, it's just another fad, like it'll be gone next year. And a lot of teachers think that way. Like I mentioned earlier, we're doing EL, which I absolutely love because for the last 20 years, Gwinnett has not focused on phonics. And this is the first year that they are focusing on phonics. And that is huge to me because that was my biggest issue with them last year. But a lot of teachers, like veteran teachers, are at the point where they're like, I'm not going to put in the time and energy and effort to learn this program and create all these resources and do all these things for the students when it's going to roll out in 2 years, and people who have been in education for 20 years, they see all these phases and fads that come and go, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't sit there. I feel like that doesn't mean you should just sit there and say, oh, screw it, like I'm not going to put any effort into it. And I am newer to teaching. This is my 3rd year, so I don't have 20 years under my belt, but I do think that you have to do what's best for your students and you have to improve the school in any way that you possibly can. I personally think that the public school system has a lot of flaws, a lot. And every day I think about them. And there's so many things that I want to do to make it better. And it's overwhelming at times, but you gradually have to change it and do the best that you can do. And I feel like believing that the schooling can't change, whether it's the grammar of schooling, whether it's the politics of schooling, whatever it is, if you sit there and you believe that you can't change it and that it never will change, then it won't because you're not putting forth that effort. So I think just doing what's in the best interest of your students and what you know is right is my solution as of right now, anyways.
Well, and I would agree too. Oh, sorry, Mariela. Do you want to go? Okay. So I think, definitely kind of like a gradual release kind of change as we do for students kind of thing is helpful because, I think if we are changing all these things at once, then how do we know what is working and what's not working if we're making 6 different pilot programs? And, I think really, if we put too much on their plates too, it's kind of as it mentions here on page 109, like it said, that they have embraced common goals, formed organizations to mobilize people and ideas and funds, and worked collaboratively to lessen a sense of isolation and burnout, and to encourage risk taking and staff development. And that's the thing too, is like I often feel that the top doesn't. They're disconnected from those of us in the classroom, and so it's definitely leading to this burnout because we are not able to band together at that point because we're honestly all just trying to stand on our own. We're just trying to make it work. And so I just think that, that it definitely has to be a slower process, but there needs to be change as the students change, as the culture changes, as everything changes. Yes, history hasn't changed, but we're raising children now in a world that wasn't the same as 20 years ago. And so I think we have to consider that as we're teaching.
I think, as most of you have said, I think the key word is gradual. I don't think like we can change the whole world in a matter of even our generation. We may be able to make some changes, but we're not going to change the whole education system. Um, I feel like it is possible if we have the adequate resources for the teachers as well as for the students. Um, the school that I've been at, I was a parapro 1 year and I started teaching. So this is my 3rd year at the school, and we've already gone through 3 full administration changes. So there's just no consistency, and our scores are one of the lowest in the county, but it all goes back to there's no consistency. So you have one principal bringing in some curriculum, then the next one brings on a new curriculum, and then the next one brings new curriculum. So there's all these changes. So you can't expect us to have those scores that you want if there's no consistency and we're barely learning one curriculum and you're changing it up to a whole new curriculum. I know our past principal really wanted to start, it was called Math by the Book. We all were really for it. We really liked it. It was a piloting program for 2 schools in the county. We wanted it. She said, we'll order you the stuff, the books, the manuals, everything. Great. Well, then she left and the new principal came in and none of that stuff got ordered. So we got stuck with one set of books for 4 teachers and one manual. So again, how can we implement that if we don't have the adequate resources? So I personally feel like it all goes back to what resources we have and what resources we can provide those students. Without those, I don't think we can make many changes.
And I have several points because I was listening to all of y'all and now I'm like, oh gosh, I need to say this and this and this. Going back to, I think Delaney talked about it, but I always say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Like you were talking about those veteran teachers who are kind of set, like they've taught for, I have a couple that are really close to retirement, so they ain't changing nothing. But they, they're the same ones that got all my sped kids last year, and they were not willing to work with me, I'm a newer teacher, and so I have a different mindset a little bit compared to them. And so when they had behavior kids, I'm like, oh, you have to reward them with a token when they're doing what they're supposed to be doing and like reinforce that behavior. And they're like, no, the expectation is this is what they need to. And I'm like, you have to work with me. Like, they're not gonna, kids are different. That's not how it was when I was in school, but now it is, and you're just gonna have to get with it. But as far as curriculum goes, we have started using what's called Eureka in math. It's a math curriculum, and they rolled it out last year, and it was gradual. It just kind of goes along with y'all's theme of gradual release. It was gradual. We did it K through 2. Then, of course, they changed it. So now it is Eureka 2.0. So this year, it is Eureka 2.0. It follows the same scheme, same, concept of Eureka, the original Eureka. It's just a little less copies because we were on a paper shortage last year. We only got 7 reams of paper. Therefore, we had to really limit what we copied, but Eureka was requiring the teachers to make tests that were 10 pages long. And so the teachers were pitching a fit because they're like, how are we supposed to give these assessments if we don't have the resources to even give the assessments in the first place? So that was one issue. But this year it's K through 5. Those 5th grade teachers who are, hell bent that they're not changing their ways are like, I don't even want to learn this Eureka. I don't want to do the summer trainings. I don't want to do any of that. It just kind of, I don't know. That's just all my thoughts based on what y'all were sharing. I just was like, you got to have the teacher buy-in. You got to have people, you have to have open-mindedness and flexibility, I feel like is very important. And then the resources, like Mariela was saying, is also, we need paper to print assessments if you want us to give them.
All right, so we are at 45 minutes, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop it here. Next discussion, I'm gonna flip the names on the paper because I feel kind of bad that it was mine and Kim's questions again this time, and I just realized it. So I'm gonna flip the names. So we'll start with different people for the next discussion because I don't think we're ever gonna get to everyone's questions.